The last rays of the twin suns sank below the jagged horizon of Elora 9, painting the barren plains in deep amber and violet. From a distance, the abandoned structure looked like a monument to despair, its spires jagged like broken teeth against the sky. Within its hollowed corridors, a solitary figure moved with measured grace, her footsteps silent on the smooth, crystalline floor. She was Elora, last of the Volari, a species once celebrated for their unmatched intellect and their unparalleled mastery over energy manipulation. Yet, that brilliance had not saved them from the slow, creeping collapse of their civilization. One by one, her kin had vanished, exiled, destroyed, or disappeared into the folds of interstellar politics she had never wished to be a part of. Now, she remained alone, a relic in a world that had grown indifferent to the legacy of the Volari. For decades, Elora had waited. She had waited for the return of her people, for someone to reclaim the knowledge of her race, for a spark of curiosity strong enough to pierce the walls she had built around herself. But in that time, she had learned to distrust the stars and the travelers who passed through them. Most were too quick, too fearful, or too cruel. They came seeking treasure, information, or conquest, and left nothing but ash and betrayal behind. Her days passed in silence, and the nights were long and empty. She would wander the vast observation hall, gaze at the stars, and speak into the void, though no one ever answered. She had grown accustomed to the absence of companionship, her loneliness a steady, numbing presence. That is, until he arrived. The human first appeared at the edge of the plains, a lone figure stepping down from a battered shuttle, its hull scarred from decades of interstellar travel. Unlike most travelers, he made no grand entrance. He did not broadcast his presence or summon drones to survey the abandoned ruins. He walked alone, deliberately, with a careful respect for the desolation around him. Elora watched him from her vantage point high above, hidden in the shadows of her observation hall. She observed the human as he approached, curious yet cautious. Humans were unpredictable creatures, brave, yes, but often reckless in ways that invited disaster. She expected him to retreat at the first sign of danger or flee when confronted with the echoes of her kind. But he did not. He paused at the base of the spire, as if sensing the presence of another life form, and then slowly sat down on the crystalline floor. Not on a bench or a hover platform, but directly on the cold, glittering surface. No words were spoken. No probes were deployed. He simply sat. Elora's mind, attuned to the subtle currents of energy around her, felt the human's fear, or rather, the absence of it. It was astonishing. Most beings would tremble, would instinctively flee from an unknown force as potent as hers. Yet he remained calm, almost reverent. She had not spoken in centuries, and yet a question formed in her mind. Unbidden? Why? For hours, Elora observed the human. He did not move much, and yet he was not idle. He traced patterns in the dust with his fingers, looked up at the twin suns as they dipped below the horizon, and occasionally glanced toward the spire as if seeking permission to proceed. Finally, Elora stepped into the open. The light of the fading suns reflected off her crystalline form, casting prismatic shadows across the floor. The human did not flinch. His eyes, wide with awe rather than fear, met hers. He began, then stopped. Words seemed inadequate in the presence of her. She could feel the hesitation in him, the careful deliberation of a species that often misunderstood beings far more ancient and powerful than themselves. "You are alone," he said finally, his voice steady but soft. "Yes," Elora replied, her tone carrying the weight of centuries. "I have waited." "Why?" he asked. Her gaze fell to the ground. "Because I must." Because if I leave, if I wander the stars like so many before me, the knowledge of my people will vanish forever. I am the last. The human nodded slowly. I understand, he said. And then, to her surprise, he added, I want to learn. That simple statement shattered the walls she had built around herself. Elora had expected curiosity, yes, but she had never encountered humility in its purest form, a willingness to learn without entitlement, without presumption. She studied him carefully, testing his resolve with subtle manipulations of energy. She summoned a small orb of light and let it hover near him. A lesser being would have recoiled or reached to seize it, drawn by fear or greed. But the human merely studied it, eyes wide with fascination, not a hint of desire to dominate. Elora felt a stir of something long dormant, hope. You may approach, she said, her voice echoing softly in the hall. The human stood and walked toward her, every step measured, respectful, unafraid. He stopped a few meters away, leaving a space between them that spoke of understanding and patience. I am called Jalen, he said, and I will do whatever it takes to preserve what remains of your people's knowledge. Elora considered him for a long moment. She had tested many over the centuries, but few had endured even a fraction of her trials. Yet Jalen's calm, unwavering presence told her he was different. You will face challenges, she warned, some of which may break you. You will see wonders and horrors alike, and most will not survive what lies ahead. Are you certain you wish to continue? I am, Jalen replied without hesitation. Because knowledge is more important than comfort. Because understanding is more important than fear. And so, Elora began to teach him. She guided him through the ruins, showing him the halls where Valari scholars had once recorded the fabric of the universe itself. She shared fragments of energy manipulation, the ability to sense and shape matter at a molecular level. She recounted history, myth, and philosophy, the intertwined legacy of her people's brilliance and folly. Jalen absorbed it all, not as a student seeking fame or fortune, but as a traveler seeking truth. He asked questions, sometimes simple, sometimes profound, and Elora answered each with patience she had long forgotten she possessed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. During that time, Jalen never complained, never sought to rush the lessons. And in return, Elora began to change. The isolation that had defined her existence began to ebb, replaced by something she had not felt in centuries: connection. She found herself anticipating his presence, noting the subtle shift in energy when he entered a room. She even laughed, quietly, at first, at his awkward attempts to navigate the alien architecture of the spire. Elora had not laughed in over 100 years. And Jalen, for his part, did not simply learn. He transformed the space around him. His human perspective, untainted by the pride and fear of the Valari, allowed him to see solutions where she had seen only despair. Together, they restored ancient systems, awakened dormant constructs, and rekindled the faint hum of energy that once coursed through the spire like the heartbeat of a living organism. It was during one such restoration that the test came. A surge of wild energy, long dormant in the spire's core, erupted unexpectedly, threatening to obliterate everything. Elora had faced similar forces in her youth, but age and isolation had dulled her reflexes. The energy twisted and roared, fracturing the crystalline floors and sending shards flying like lethal rain. Move, she shouted, but Jalen did not retreat. Instead, he stood firm, his hands outstretched, his mind focused. Trust me, he said. Elora hesitated. And then, instinctively, she flowed into the energy with him, guiding it rather than resisting, shaping it rather than fleeing. Together, they harnessed the surge, bending the violent power into a stable, pulsating core that illuminated the entire spire. When the energy settled, silence filled the hall. Elora looked at Jalen and realized something extraordinary. For the first time in centuries, she had not felt alone. You survived," she whispered, awestruck. Jalen smiled. "Because you didn't have to survive alone anymore." In the weeks that followed, the spire came alive again. Knowledge, once thought lost, was cataloged, recorded, and preserved. Constructs that had been dormant for centuries hummed with newfound purpose. Elora watched, sometimes from a distance, sometimes walking beside Jalen as he explored the halls she had once traversed in solitude. And always, she noticed how he remained calm in the presence of the immense, almost incomprehensible power that surrounded them. Where other beings might have bowed or fled, he walked with confidence and humility. One evening, as the twin suns set in their fiery descent, Jalen sat on the crystalline floor in the same spot he had first chosen, looking out at the horizon. Without thinking, Elora sat beside him. No words were exchanged at first. They simply watched the dying light of the suns together. "You are not like the others," she said finally, her voice soft, almost shy. "And you are not like anyone I've ever met," he replied. It was not a confession. It was an acknowledgement, a shared understanding of what it meant to be alone, and to find someone who could stand beside you without fear. Elora felt something stir deep within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with energy manipulation or the currents of the spire. It was trust. It was companionship. It was hope. For the first time in centuries, she believed the Valari legacy would endure, not simply in knowledge, but in spirit, carried forward by one who had chosen to sit beside her, unafraid, and learn. Time flowed differently within the spire, and eventually, Elora knew the day would come when Jalen must leave, when his path would take him back to the stars beyond. Yet she no longer feared it. She had waited long enough to understand that true connection was not bound by time or space. When that day arrived, Jalen rose and turned to her. "I will carry your legacy, Elora," he promised. "And I will return, whenever the stars allow me." Elora nodded, feeling the weight of centuries lift from her shoulders. "Then I will wait," she said. But not alone. Not anymore. And as he departed into the expanse of the cosmos, she remained in the spire, her heart no longer heavy with solitude. For she had learned that waiting was not a sentence, it was a choice. And some waits, if met with courage and openness, could be ended not by the arrival of anyone, but by the willingness of one human to sit beside her without fear. The twin suns dipped below the horizon once more, and Elora smiled, knowing the light of her people would never fade, not while hope and courage endured. Time flowed differently within the spire, and eventually, Elora knew the day would come when Jalen must leave, when his path would take him back to the stars beyond. Yet she no longer feared it. She had waited long enough to understand that true connection was not bound by time or space. When that day arrived, Jalen rose and turned to her. His expression carried both excitement and the weight of knowing the journey ahead would test him in ways she could not protect him from. "I will carry your legacy, Elora," he promised. "And I will return, whenever the stars allow me." Elora nodded, feeling the weight of centuries lift from her shoulders. "Then I will wait," she said. But not alone. Not anymore. Before leaving, Jalen placed a small crystalline device on the floor between them. It pulsed with a soft, warm light, the energy signature of Elora's own heart, captured as a beacon. "This will remind you that your people live on, even if I cannot always be here," he said. "And it will guide me back to you, no matter how far the stars carry me." Elora touched the device, feeling the familiar hum of her own energy entwined with his. She realized then that she no longer waited for someone to arrive out of obligation or loneliness. She waited with hope, knowing that the connection they had forged was stronger than the isolation of centuries. As Jalen's shuttle lifted off and ascended into the sky, the spire shimmered with renewed life. Its corridors glowed with energy, humming in resonance with the device he had left behind. Elora walked through the halls, observing the systems she and Jalen had restored. Each pulse, each spark of energy, was a reminder that her people's knowledge, wisdom, and spirit would endure through him, through anyone who came with courage and humility. Elora returned to the observation hall, sitting on the same platform where she had first watched Jalen approach. The twin suns rose again, casting golden light across the plains. For the first time, she felt unshackled from centuries of isolation. Her vigil was no longer a burden, it was a promise. She would continue to protect the spire, to nurture the knowledge of her people, and to wait for those brave enough to approach without fear. Days turned into months, and she observed travelers come and go, but none stayed, not until Jalen's return. Yet she did not despair. She had learned the patience of the stars themselves. Her solitude, once a prison, had become a sanctuary, a place of learning, growth, and eternal hope. Then, one quiet evening, a familiar hum reached her ears. Elora rose and approached the spire's entrance, her heart quickening. A shuttle descended, carrying the unmistakable figure of Jalen. He stepped down, his eyes alight with the same wonder she remembered. "You returned," she whispered, emotion thick in her voice. "I promised," he said, extending his hand. "And I bring more than myself this time. I bring the knowledge we've gathered, the stories of worlds beyond, and the assurance that your people will never be forgotten." Elora smiled, a radiant, almost human smile, and took his hand. For the first time in centuries, she felt truly understood, not merely observed, not merely remembered, but truly seen. The centuries of waiting, the loneliness, the fear of extinction, all of it melted into this moment. Together, they walked through the spire, planning, restoring, and preparing for the day when Elora's people could rise again, not as rulers or conquerors, but as a legacy of knowledge and hope shared freely with those brave enough to learn. The twin suns dipped once more below the horizon, but this time, their light was mirrored in Elora's heart. She was no longer alone. She had waited, and the universe had answered, not with a savior, but with a human who dared to sit beside her without fear. And in that choice, a new era began.